Thank you all for making the time to join us this morning as we share with you the outputs of work that FSD Kenya, MFX Partners, and LexTego have been doing since November last year. FSD Kenya is an independent trust dedicated to the achievement of an inclusive financial system that supports Kenya's long-term development goals. MFX Partners is a consultancy firm in the digital, mobile, and financial inclusion space that specializes in mobile finance deployment in emerging markets. LexTego is a fintech based in the UK that is building an open source anti-financial crime platform to support the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation's program of accelerating financial services for the poor. Part of FSD Kenya's work intersects financial sector policy and regulation. Kenya's financial sector landscape is today characterized by business models that leverage consumers' digital footprints to build and offer innovative solutions that have put Kenya on the global map. In 2019, a Data Protection Act was enacted to, among others, regulate the processing of personal data, defining the rights and obligations of data subjects, processors, and controllers. However, our focus today is not to interrogate the letter of the act. Rather, we are here to offer practical guidance on how providers in Kenya could practically comply with the new law in a pragmatic manner while keeping the customer first. That last point is important as we strongly believe that implementation and compliance with the law should not be a tick box exercise, but rather a deliberate effort to keep the customer's interest at heart. Excuse me. Today, we will share with you some of the tools and solutions that can help in implementing various provisions of the Act, such as implementing a data access request, managing, handling, and protecting unstructured data, conducting an impact assessment, and so on and so forth. To take us through this will be Leslie Ann Vaughan from MFX Partners, and Rob Reeve from LexTego will be our key speaker. Rob Reeve has a background of 14 years working in the fintech space across more than 40 countries. He has worked for some of the largest telcos in the world, working on innovation in the payment space in developing and developed markets. Before moving into open source software, Rob was the acting CEO of a unicorn neobank in the Netherlands. Leslie Ann has been working in emerging markets for digital financial services innovation since 2005, including being part of the M-Pesa founding team. In recent years, she has worked for the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, SIGAP, IFC, Microsoft, MasterCard Action Center for Financial Inclusion, EFINA, GSMA, FSD Tanzania, DFID, and UNCDF as a freelance consultant. She has also been involved in supporting startups like M-Copper Solar with their platform development. Leslie Ann recently joined Moja Loop Foundation as the Director of Product and Strategy. My name is Francis Guer. I'm the Policy Specialist at FSD Kenya, and I will be your moderator for today. Without much further ado, kindly let us allow Leslie Ann Vaughan to make her opening remarks. Thank you.
But the reality is that thinking about this involves you really thinking about it from your product management perspective. And where this project started was from the perspective of me working with some product managers in the Kenya product manager meetup, and seeing that often this is thought of as an IT issue, it's thought of as a cybersecurity issue, it's thought of as a legal issue with the legal teams, not a product management issue. And the reality is it has to be designed into our products if we want to do this, both from a compliance perspective, but also for a good business perspective. So this is where this conversation started, and where really this project that Rob and Francis have been leading has come from. It's useful to be able to think through, what does good look like from a data perspective? How do I get compliant? But also, how do I do the right thing by my customers? What do customers actually want? And so, Rob, it's over to you. Oh, actually,
I would say you've got 2 more slides, I'm afraid, 2 examples, but it's a good transition point. So, yeah.
So just to show you that this is not, the 2 examples I brought to the table here are showing you there are fintechs in Kenya already thinking deeply about this conversation that we're having today. So one example is pingme.com. And this company are fundamentally taking some of the principles of what you see in businesses like Branch and Mshwari and Jumo and Tala, and looking at alternative data, but actually putting the customer in charge of it and saying, MFIs and banks, you don't have to do all of this yourself. We'll build a business that is around doing consumer data well. So you don't have to build it. Sometimes you can actually use services that exist. Or maybe your business could pivot to say, this is good business. You could think about how to be the custodian and the consumer protection and person if you've got the right skills in-house. The second example goes towards identity and biometrics, because data is not just about your SMSs and your mobile social channel data. Actually, your identity is central. And an inclusive identity can often start with a biometric, but biometrics must be protected in a very important way. So starting with biometrics for yourself, you've got a huge amount of conversation to think about. This company work in the development sector. They work on vaccine identification. How do you know who has been vaccinated? They were working long before COVID. and they use a biometric with communities to record who has received vaccinations. And so they have a toolkit that they launch with development agencies that are doing vaccinations in rural areas in an East African context and beyond. A couple of very different examples of data protection. So Rob, yes, over to you.
Thank you, Leslie. Yeah, I think we're going to be going through a lot more. Unfortunately, the driver behind this comes with a legal disclaimer. I'm going to bore everybody for the next hour and a half over lots of legislation. No, I'm going to try not to bore you. My team who have joined have said, please don't make us fall asleep. So I'll try my best, but it does come with a disclaimer. I'm not a lawyer. I'm not a lawyer by trade, and FSD is not providing legal advice with the provision of this document. So it's worth noting for everybody that we're going to review the law, but every single person's context and the implications for them is slightly different. And we're also subject to regulation, and the regulator's view may also be different to our own. So there is a disclaimer here that this is not legal advice. Oops, apologies. This is not legal advice, but the goal here is to try and give everybody an opportunity to understand what is the regulation and the law. What does it mean to me? And as Leslie Ann points out, it's not just a data protection officer's activities. And apologies, that was my watch because I need to keep at the beginning of time. So I'm just going to quickly stop the video, stop sharing, and jump back in a second. So I just jumped back to the beginning. Apologies there. There's always one technical issue, isn't there? So, as I said, the presenting again. There we go. And now presenting and sharing my screen. I'm sharing my full screen, so hopefully everyone can now see that. So if everyone can, I'm going to carry on.
Yes, Rob, carry on.
Perfect. Agenda that we've got through, and the main thing that we look at, the background to the documents that we've published. I'll go into the documents. There'll be 3 documents that will be coming out, but we're going to be going through today just one of those, as we've only released one of those. We'll then go through establishing a team, where's the data, finding hidden data, there's some challenges with data, implementing a data protection impact assessment, and then some tools and resources. As we go through, a number of these things are all interconnected. What you'll find as you go through these projects is that more and more things will be, okay, I do X, that affects Y, that affects Z, or that affects X. It is a very cyclical problem, and data protection is an issue not just for one person within a company, but the whole company. And there are implications across the board. First of all, then we're going to go through the documents. As I say, there are 3 documents we've made available. The first, which was in the invitation link you would have seen at the bottom, is on the implementation guidance. The other that we're launching again shortly will be the regulatory review. What we wanted to do is issue the guidance and then shortly afterwards go back and revisit the regulatory review. Our challenge is that this is unfortunately, every time the Office of the Data Protection Commissioners launch a new guidance or regulation, we need to update this document. So it's a good starting point. But because of the continuous changes, we want to make sure we made the last changes the minute we've launched the guidance to make sure everything dovetails very nicely together. So those will be issued shortly. So if you haven't already, at the end, Francis will tell people how to keep informed and to be aware of those launches as they come. The first one that we're going to go through in a bit of detail and spend a lot of this presentation going through is the implementation guidance. As Leslie Ann said, it's aimed at product managers, IT managers working in fintechs in Kenya. But it's trying to identify the next steps of their implementation of the Kenyan Data Protection Act. You'll hear the word GDPR, CCPA, and a few other words as we go through. We went for the name DAPA because it sounds really good and sounds quite posh. So DAPA is the name we've just unfortunately abbreviated the Data Protection Act for. But as we go through, we'll be talking to DAPA. I'm not just talking about a nice gentleman with a nice hat. I'm talking about the Data Protection Act. But there's a couple of key sections within there. The first parts we're going to go through just quickly was an assessment and a drill down, and we'll have a poll in a moment where we basically asked a lot of personnel, people in the product space and the agile space, what they were currently doing within data protection. Then we start looking at some of the specific impacts for data protection in the fintech context. So in the document, this is the shorter of the two documents, and bad news, this one's the 60-odd page version. There is a 90-odd page version that will be coming out, that's the regulatory review, but we'll come to that in a second. But we go through what are the specific impacts for data protection in the fintech context. I'll go through later on and share why am I, who's a person who's worked in the operational side of fintechs around the world, why am I so bothered about data protection? That becomes very clear when you work out that I'm building an anti-fraud, anti-financial crime platform. You'll see later on why even the compliance team and the operations teams need to be aware of data protection. But then we go through some implementation. What have other people done around the world? We've used cookies because it's difficult to get to the heart of many organizations' true data protection strategy and approach, but we try to talk to those later on. So, as I said, we should be data driven, and Nancy's and Francis, I'm not sure how we're going to just quickly do a poll. Are we putting this in the chat? Are we able to just quickly do that? Is that available? We're able to, Francis, are we able to provide the poll?
Yes, trying to work it out.
Here we go. Okay, so we've put together a poll, and that should now be in your messages. If you're full screen, just if you can just step back, the whole poll should hopefully be in front of you. These are the same sort of questions. We've asked a few more to get guidance on how to drive this document. We're going to do some more, and we just wanted to know who's attending, the types of companies that you are, and then the type of personal data you're processing. And then your sharing and your current status, whether you have a data protection officer. And one of the key questions is, now we've had guidance from the ODPC, how are you sharing your data? And how are you managing a data subject access request? Have you now got a clear policy? That will help us as we go through, that I can call out some salient points. But I'm just going to go through now and just present what we received as our response when we actually did this the first time around. Our survey respondents included digital lenders, aggregators, online market providers, insurance firms, MNOs, other fintech firms, all performing different roles as either a data controller or a processor. The legislation has more onus towards a controller. That's the person who is managing the customer. But processors normally act or work with a controller. So the data processors also have some responsibilities, and regularly within the regulations and guidance, the ODPC doesn't make any distinction. They just say, you're managing the data, you need to actually process this and start working your challenges through and making sure they're very clear. Francis, I see you're raising your hand. Is everything?
I just wanted to check on the poll. Are we asking attendees to answer all the questions now, or we'll be doing them sequentially?
If we can do those now, then whilst I'm doing the findings from the previous poll, we can go through and get the responses that and compare how are we doing at the end of this. So I'm going to be spending about 5 minutes going through our previous respondents. So if you could, yes, please. Thanks, Francis. That's a good point. If you can fill in the poll whilst I'm talking through these, then we can review how are we doing on this call and what are the changes. So then after we understand who's responding, we had a good selection of firms. It was a small poll, but every single piece of information helps us. They dealt with a broad spread of personal data types, including sensitive data. Leslie Ann was talking to the need for biometrics. For those who've got into the legislation, you'll see that that's under the sensitive personal data. There are certain types of personal data, but then there's sensitive personal data, things you have to take more care of. As defined in DAPA. So from that perspective, you've got to look at your data very, very carefully. We'll come to that later on. A number of the respondents use data from online sources, such as social networking. There are some implications there. And they understand the relationship with the data subject. So they're using lots and lots of data points. Given the nature and the service of the firms, the capturing of data was high on the lists for data collection. So basically understanding my KYC process. Who is this customer? Why are they coming to me? How can I help them? And then the analysis of payment data and subjects credit history with the highest of types. Everyone was aware of the Kenyan Data Protection Act, 100% positive rate, which was great, and good news for the ODPC. It means that people are aware of it, waiting for the guidance. This survey was taken in December, so again, getting we're hoping that everyone's still aware of the Act, and there aren't people who aren't aware of it, because the regulation is now becoming quite firm. The respondents' awareness of other international legislation was also key. We'll go to it briefly in a moment when we go through the next document, but GDPR and CCPA can affect organizations not in the European Union and not in California, and they are a definition of those. And 66% of those affected are also aware of being impacted. So people were aware of these external regulations and also knew that they were impacted. So that's great news that people are aware of the wider world's regulation, because that's what's going to help Kenya with its data protection, is when everybody's aware of each other's regulation and they're broadly aligned. So that was our first survey question, set of survey questions. Then we got into what are they currently doing? And most organizations have not appointed a dedicated data protection officer. That was interesting. We'll come to what the regulation requires later. Most had a plan to recruit, but some weren't planning to recruit anybody. The next was the seniority of these personnel. This comes down to one of the bigger challenges for DAPA is the fines involved. As Leslie Ann pointed out, the fine to WhatsApp in the hundreds of millions is actually the second largest. The largest was going to Facebook, to Amazon. So from that perspective, the GDPR regulation has massive reach, whereas DAPA, unfortunately, currently has a maximum. And beyond that, every company is treated the same, irrespective of their size. So those are things that we suspect will be changing. But again, it also drives this recruitment and appointment. Currently, it's mainly general employees. But the largest challenge, as we say, is the data commissioner may find that it doesn't have the importance they thought it would have. And again, there are things where we've seen in the world, and we'll come to those later, where that change has actually led to a change in approach by the data protection commissioner in a country. We then asked them how they were sharing, and the majority of companies are sharing information, and that sharing, that is where it suddenly becomes quite complicated. When we come to some examples of cookie consent, because they're the easiest to show, you'll see where this becomes quite clear what companies are doing to say who are they sharing with. And then the next portion came down to what controls do they have. Since we did the survey, the guidance on consent has been released, and a number of these answers, unfortunately, aren't fit for purpose. So a number of organizations will probably have to go back and revisit some of their historical decisions and say, have we done the right thing? And are we now in the right place from a regulation perspective? We'll go through that later. I see in the chat that the Lawyers Hub from Kenya, I attended one of their early seminars, and some of those things, you will need some legal advice, as we said, and that's not for us to place, but it's great to see that the Lawyers Hub are here. And if you haven't seen that link, please do click on it. It's great that they're here to help us and join us here. But this is a shared problem, like many of these things, and if we all come together and start helping each other, we'll start addressing some of the challenges we need to face. And then we asked people, have they started to make changes, or are they still in the process? I'm just mindful of time, so I'm going to move quite quickly on. We asked people what were the opportunities and challenges they saw. Many of the organizations, fortunately, the same as Leslie Ann pointed out, saw that this was an opportunity to differentiate, to actually become and say, look, we want to look after you. We skimmed over it very quickly, but the CGAP research, which Leslie Ann was talking to, was talking about the fact that people in Kenya were willing to actually pay a higher interest rate to have their data protected than pay the lower interest rate. So again, these are the sorts of things where it's not just borne by, yeah, we're doing the right thing, but customers are also responding to that. The challenges, again, were lack of guidance, and some felt that they would be constrained, disproportionately constrained, but candidly, smaller firms, their revenue impact is going to be lower. It's 1% of their revenue for the previous year is what the fine could be. And again, this is where we think there may be some early faltering until the penalties become equivalent to those of GDPR. But apologies, this is a typo here. The unique challenges that are pertinent to Kenya also need to be considered. And some of those things are coming out in how you capture consent. We'll cover that later. But consent on USSD could be quite complicated. And again, these things need to be thought through. And there's also one unfortunate side. GDPR has within the regulation the option for a fee to be charged for too many requests. But currently, under DAPA, there is no fee for abusive. So if I wanted to be difficult, I could send a request every day that has to be responded to within a time frame to a company, or as many companies as I like, and keep them all busy responding to my data subject access requests without any impunity at all. I can get a response and ask for the same data again. So this whole process of managing those, that could be a problem for many organizations, and something that when we look at the other documents is where we've already fed back. We're going to cover the rest of the chapters of the document in the seminar, the rest of this webinar. But Francis, do we have any of the results? If not, we can jump to later into come back to this later on. But if we've got those later on, I can stop sharing temporarily and then reshare.
Yeah, Rob, I can see some responses already coming in.
Are we able to? Should we share those at the end? Leave that to the end?
Yeah, sure. We can leave that to the end. Maybe a couple of guys will join in.
Thank you. Okay. So carry on. So the other, and this is unfortunately the document that's more a book and actually would put you to sleep. It's actually the regulatory framework. It's aimed at data protection officers more specifically, as well as regulatory advisors. We basically compared not just the DAPA and its impact and its implications, but also how it compared against other regulations, such as GDPR and CCPA. I was challenged when I suggested CCPA, why CCPA? I'll come to that point in a moment. But first, the first section we go through is understanding the data protection. And we broke that down into a number of discrete portions. This is just early advisory of what's coming. So I'm going to skip through this fairly quickly. But we went through a number of areas and we built those against the principles, and we tried to structure the legislation against the principles and assess those as best we could. Some of the elements don't fully meet into those principles, and but we'll go through that at another time. But why compare DAPA with CCPA and GDPR? Well, as we said in the survey, everyone was aware, the majority of people were aware of GDPR and CCPA and what it meant to them. Anybody working where a foreign national is going to be a customer, they also need to be aware of GDPR and CCPA. So Kenya, because of its high volume of tourists, pre-COVID, high volume of tourists, would have had an implication at some point that they are at risk of breaching GDPR or CCPA. Both of them do apply. So an awareness of those is quite useful. The other reason why for CCPA, though, is that the US is historically being one of the biggest abusers of the use of data. The tech world is centered around California and the West Coast. So from that perspective, California making a move to start bringing in regulation to protect consumers is a good start. It doesn't go as far as the other regulations, but it is a good starting point. But just so everyone's clear, because of the companies working in California, California's GDPR alone makes it the 5th largest global economy. So when companies that are based there have to follow guidance for the residents there, they will be paying attention. So the other portion is we looked at each piece of regulation. So it's been based on the same foundation principles. The principles are available on the right: the lawfulness, fairness, transparency, and purpose limitation. We use those principles to identify key questions that we found from the survey. And then for each question, we provided a summary and guidance on the implications. So what is this guidance really trying to say, both from the regulation and the Act itself? We gave some impact and some feedback on some of the policy recommendations. One example that we recommended, for example, is that the current interpretation of how to apply a fine could be tweaked. Currently, unfortunately, my personal view is there are not enough teeth in the fine side. As I mentioned, in Singapore, we saw that Singapore started with a low fine and then increased that to increase the priority. When we look at the survey respondents, you spend the money to combat legal problems based on the cost of that legal fine should it manifest. With the fines being what they are, organizations may not go to the best efforts. So again, we put some recommendations and some improvements. Some of those have been changed and some improvements have come through, for example, in consent, which we'll go through in a moment. That consent guidance is much better than when we started this process, and those sorts of things and those improvements will make things a lot better and a lot clearer for many organizations. So we've used the other regulations to say, look, best practice worldwide is this, do this in Kenya, and actually you could be going beyond and creating world class. As Leslie Ann said, there are many things that you've done. My career was started because of M-Pesa. I joined the fintech world because of M-Pesa. So, and that was because the UK was responding to what was happening in Africa. So don't underestimate the value that you can do to be pioneers and leaders in the world. The relevant legislation is also been put there. So in the two documents, we have one with the legislation and one without the legislation. So people who want to go, okay, well, you're saying this, but where is that in the Act? So we pull all of that together so it's all in one simple place. Okay, so the next part, I'm just going to jump into some webinars, and I've purposely deleted all my cookies because everyone assumes that cookies and everything else, I've got to do X, Y, and Z. But you'll see as I go through that as I launch these, and apologies, that's now come to the wrong page, how a regulator approaches their cookies is also important. I saw an article from a colleague who the other day was annoyed by this pop-up. You'll see in a second that when I go to the Netherlands, there are ways of managing cookies that don't require you to capture lots of information. That's the challenge. We'll also go through some of the user behaviors that these things are doing as well, because again, there are challenges and approaches that we need to look at. But in this, I've got the option to accept or reject all cookies. So I'm just going to reject all cookies and see what happens. Everybody should be doing, back to the product question, there's your first web page. It's now affected every single thing your product will do because I've rejected all cookies, because that's what the data protection allows me to do. Does your product even work with me doing that setting? Many sites fail at that point. I now have no cookies from the Information Commission's office in the UK. The ICO, we used in advance of the ODPC site starting to provide guidance. We use the ICO as a good example because it's in English and all their guidance is English. The challenge with post-Brexit, we are now looking at changing our regulations so it's not as aligned with GDPR. I'm hoping that's not for the worst, but we shall see where that goes. But the advantage of the UK is there's a lot of walkthroughs, a large volume of insight is available. There's insight for organizations as well as consumers. Apologies, I'm going to look left, but so I can actually see my screen. So you can see for the consumer, you've got a couple of, what are the rights of the consumer? And then for organizations, what does that mean? These can be used as a starting point, but again, check those against the DAPA to see where they are. The regulations are broadly aligned, but there are one or two differences. So please do, if you use this, remember that this is just a reference point and can help you. One of the examples is for guide to data protection. So what is data protection? What is GDPR? Again, helping companies. So these sorts of steps could be useful for organizations. We go into a bit more detail in the regulatory book when that's available. I just want to move on to some of the others, but again, there's some guidance here of how do I pay my fees, report a breach, make a complaint. But it also keeps the fines front and center. The Netherlands, the Dutch website, that's actually available in English. This is the EN. I've got it set to automatically translate. So I'm going to jump to the Dutch version. This is more an information page. Therefore, its primarily purpose is to tell people what's happening within the Dutch regulation. But when I move to the Dutch page and it's automatically translated, you'll see that there's more guidance for people within the country. So in the European perspective, they're doing the same sort of thing where they're providing guidance. But of those we assessed, the UK site is actually much better at providing guidance than any of the others under the historic GDPR. We also looked at South Africa. This may or may not work. I've been having problems early this morning. I'm less worried about this site working because unfortunately, when I go into it, and already for everyone's happiness, we're already seeing that the ODPC in Kenya is not following the guidance of South Africa. South Africa's website is purely for lawyers. And currently it's been, we might be able to get to it, so hopefully we'll be able to see it. It's literally, I've taken it that long since I clicked, and it's still opening up. So, and I have a 900 megabit connection, so it's not my internet connection. But the website, if it's available, is a very legal heavy document. So it's you know, for product owners or for non-lawyers, it's not that helpful. And okay, it's down at the moment and has been all morning, so apologies for that. The other we looked at, and another country that actually does provide a very good example, and is a much smaller, is Singapore. The Singapore site provides very clear guidance, allows more detailed drill down. So again, some of the tools we reference are actually referenced from the Singapore website. So in the documentation later on, this website, if you want to go have a look through and see what they're proposing, some of the things they're doing in here are actually very useful. The same way as when we started this web page, you know, Immaculate Kasai hadn't actually been appointed at the time that we started this document. She's now been appointed and actually starting to make some big leaps. Our view here is that it's in the early stages, but actually you'll see that their focus is on taking action. The first thing they want you to do is, what is it, you know, I need to do something. I want to file a complaint. So for people who are not thinking this is important, the first thing the data commissioner is doing is increasing their awareness around the world and making sure others are engaging, making sure consumers know how to file a complaint, raise a concern, or have a general inquiry. That's the first things they're doing, calls to action. That's actually a very strong message to those who are considering it's not going to go anywhere. It might take some time. It's very clear it's important. And then informing the data subjects of their rights. Then they come to the data controllers and processors, but they've started to provide guidance and guidelines as well. And these are actually quite good documents. They're actually improving on the Act. So things that we want to call out here is the data protection impact assessment, this document here. We'll come to those in a moment. And the guidance note on consent, which we'll drill down to in a little bit more detail later. So the documentation and the resources becoming available are improving. And that's the reason we wanted to just hold off until now, so we can launch the guidance for implementation, and then come back and revisit with this new consent and the documents that are there to give people an example. So going into the consent, this is covered in section 30 of the Act. So section 30 of the Act covers in detail consent. As I've just shown you, there's a new guidance. This guidance has been based on the Act itself, privacy and data protection policy, but also international best practice. So there are 8 legal bases for actually processing data. There is consent to the processing of one or more specified purposes. So I'm saying yes. All the processing is necessary. This is the basis of what's called legitimate interest. You'll see how this is being abused in Europe, and we'll see how the ODPC manage this later on. It could also be for the performance of a contract, you know, and this can be before entering into the contract. So you have to give consent before you enter the contract for your data to be processed. So if you think of, for the banking and the financial services world, KYC and onboarding process, you would need to give consent for your processing to be done before you enter the contract. Same for credit control. But there are some gotchas that are going to come up beyond this. Now we've gone into consent and the guidance has gone into a little bit more detail. You know, it's also for any compliance with any legal obligations. So for financial services, anti-terrorism acts, you know, there's a whole bunch of regulation again in the main document. We go through in a bit more detail of what some of those things mean, because some of our business processes are going to be affected by this. We're seeing that very heavily in the European market. There's also for the performance of a task carried out in the public interest or the exercise of official authority vested in the controller, the performance of any task carried out by a public authority. So there's a lot of, the government has to do their job and those jobs will continue. So for the exercise by any person in the public interest. So again, these are the legislation. So I'll leave these and I'll move on to what does that mean to us? So when we look into the guidelines, You know, lawful basis is only valid if, and it's a big if, the customer is offered control, a genuine choice about accepting or declining the terms, and there are some really strong terms that come up in the guidance. Data controllers and subjects run the risk that consent will be ignored if it is illusory. That is in the specific wording within the guidelines. So the word illusory is you've created something and you give the pretense that you can tick, but if you don't tick, you don't get a service, then you're not really giving them a choice. There are some grey areas that are introduced because of the legitimate interest, lawful requirement and illusory, but those will flush themselves out quite quickly. But then it's also down to the fairness, necessity and proportionality. Within our original guidance, we said you need to think through about this fairness and proportionality because it wasn't being considered properly. Is this necessary for the specified purpose? That was not clear in the original act. The regulation guidelines do make that very clear, that do you really need that data? Should be the first question that you're asking before you ask for data. And that's the fundamentally changing process to where we lived before. And the words free and informed also become quite important with a strong onus. You know, clarity and simplicity become important. Going back to our earlier, well, what does that mean to USSD? Actually, that could be quite complicated because go look at the long terms and conditions, but I've got to read those before I go and accept them. So again, there's some challenges that this will present. Back to Leslie Ann's comment, product managers need to be aware of this because their user experience is about to be disrupted. So the time to review those is one of the key things, as I say, for USSD. But again, is that the same for your agents? You know, it's not just the digital channels. This act applies to everything, just so there's some clarity. I have a bookshelf behind this wallpaper here, and I also have a locked cabinet. If I had data of customers, that cabinet is covered by Data Protection Act. I've got to be sure I know what's in there and that it's protected. You know, that's the reality. You know, there are some really strong implications of this. The data control and data processor's identity needs to be declared. So you have to make it clear they know who the parties are that are managing and processing your data, as well as those relying on the consent. You'll see this in some examples in a minute of bad consent, that they're doing this part well, but there's actually some bad user experience that they're forcing. You've got to make sure the purposes of the processing are clear. That purpose is really important because if you change it later, it may or may not apply, and you've got to be careful. You may have to go back to a customer and say, we've changed the purpose of why we need your data. You've got to get consent again. Granular consent for each separate type of processing. That means you might have a big checklist if you do lots of things. So again, the reality is here is we've abused the volume of data. And this is the response from a regulatory perspective, because that abuse and that overuse of marketing and sales has led to a, please stop using your data. Do you really need it? And then the right to withdraw consent. Again, it's easy to create it at introduction, but how do you withdraw? Because that is the right of the customer. I don't want to give you that consent anymore, and I still need to do these tasks. The burden of proof is also a problem when it comes to this consent. And that clear affirmative act, I did something that's very clear and it's definite yes, not in my head and video recording it, might get you away with it, but it's at risk of abuse. And that lawful basis, why we use the data, needs to be applied consistently. So if you start today with lawful basis 1 and you see that lawful basis 2 is actually, oh, I should have been using this, I'm using it for this lawful basis. You said this, you can't have the data for that because you didn't tell them it was for that. So again, there are some gotchas that you will need some legal guidance for specific nuances. But as I say, one of the things we have to look at is the purposes of processing and that evidence. If you get audited, and this is one of the challenges for KYC, you need the KYC data for as long as you have a relationship with the customer. That is data that you are holding. The consent to hold that data, you will need to keep the evidence for that consent for as long as you keep that data. If you haven't got evidence for consent, you are at risk of falling foul of the regulation that says you do not have evidence there's an affirmative act that you've done. Again, these changes are quite dramatic, and they're all outlined within the consent guidance. So I would draw people's attention to drill into those quite quickly. The poll results are starting to come through. We'll look at those in a moment. The consent obtained before. So this is one of the things that was also unclear. What happened? This legislation's come in. I had data before. Consent obtained before the act will remain valid. The key point here, consent obtained. If you can't evidence that consent, you don't have it. You can't have that data. That is a fundamental change. The consent will be in line with the act and validly obtained. So it's going to apply the same rules and regulations of how did you get that data? And if you just got it because you scraped it because the customer didn't know, that's not getting consent. You don't have the affirmative act that showed that they have consented. That's going to be a challenge. This also needs to be reviewed as because you had it for one purpose, has your purpose changed? Again, you're under the same rules and regulations. So from that perspective, there are some real big things you've got to work through. There's also a question of consent. I see a question coming up. I will answer that question specifically in a moment on the consent should be an illegal act. The consent is there. Those processing data that is likely to result in a high risk to data subjects should submit a DPIA. We'll come to DPIAs in a moment. But that was the question I personally had was, okay, everybody has to submit a DPIA before processing. I'm processing. If you are high risk, likely to result in a high risk, then you need to submit a DPIA. That interpretation could put you in trouble. The consent, so just, Selena, just to make sure I understand your question, the consent should be in the legal act. The definition of consent is covered in the act, but the guidance goes into a lot more detail of, okay, you're saying consent, and just to go back a page a second, the clear affirmative act, that could be something in writing or an audio recording. It can be in digital form as well, so clicking on a checkbox within a web page should be covered as part of that. But again, you've got to make sure you've got auditability, and you can, if someone can change those data points, and the data commissioner says, "Well, I can go in and change your database, and you've given consent to everybody. How do I know?" Your audit trail needs to be quite good on that for your logs, etc. So the consent is already covered. I hope that answered your question. If not, we'll come back to it at the end of the process. And again, I'm not a lawyer, but if somebody here from Lawyers Hub, I will be asking them to help us. Again, you're not giving any specific guidance or giving general guidance. Every organization should look at their own specific needs and get some proper counsel on this. So now we've done this, I'm just going to jump through some good examples. So as I was showing you before, Blue Wave, we did some research, and they use cookies. They don't use it to harvest data. They just have we use cookies. This is a Kenyan organization. Here's their contact details. They've not got everything they need. They have a privacy policy, but they use cookies, and that's it. I've got consent. To me, that's one of the better user experiences. I'm going to use an article because this was sent to me, and I was caught in the middle of it. And it's the impact of Brexit on people who I've had friends who want to bring their partners here, currently estranged. But this is the consent for the Guardian newspaper. I've tried not to shame people publicly, but the link takes us there. So I'm going to manage my cookies. For those of you who are in a product environment will understand the importance of a web page and what you color code to drive to action and what you don't. You'll see here that I have the user consent. Oh, excellent. Everything's turned off by default. But now I start doing this and I start trawling through things and I start going, okay, where do I click again? I've got this reject all and accept all. It's really small. The stuff that's highlighted is drawn there to make you come to that and away from the reject all or accept all. I've got the save and close. It will now, if I clicked on the save and close, which is highlighted, that's the one that's the call to action, save and close. I will accept whatever the other settings are within this web page. And this is where the abuse has started to draw in on consent. And there's a gray area in GDPR where legitimate interest is being abused. So all these things here are great. Okay, so that's lovely. Let's look at legitimate interest. Hang on, its default status is on. So everything I just said no to in the user consent has just been overwritten by this legitimate interest. Our legitimate interest is we're a marketing organization. We want to sell you stuff, so we're going to give you targeted ads. That's in legitimate interest. Irrespective of the fact that I have user consent that says turn it off, my legitimate interest is but you also accepted that. So thank you, we're still going to track you. So this bypassing of consent here into legitimate interest is one of the areas that the GDPR regulators are starting to drill into to say, okay, is this really valid? So, okay, well, that's all well and good. It's all done then, isn't it? Well, no, actually, you click on some of these and you'll find that the site vendors are off, but all the users' legitimate interest. So I now, as a user, seem to think I have to click on every single off. Just to give you a sense, this is me just scrolling gently through the page. You know, I'm going to be here half an hour. I just clicked on an article to read it. The default answer is save and close. I'm going to do that because I delete cookies when I exit the site and I only allow certain sites. I am that bad, but you know, this is the problem that you have. I'm now going to use an example of a merchant store in another country. So Egypt has also issued regulation. This site is capturing cookies. They captured 18 cookies just on this page. I'm registered in the UK, and there is Data Protection Act applying the same requirements in Egypt. Zero compliance. And this is the challenge. These are bad examples. This is just abuse. The other is bad management. And Blue Wave, a Kenyan organization, is getting it right. So again, there are ways of creating a great user experience without needing all that data, and use the data when you need to and look at the ways you capture that. Those are the advices that we're getting. So those are the first portions. So before we move on, I see we've got the poll response. Thanks, Bobby. It's good to know it's owned by, it's even worse, a Dutch company, one of the most data sensitive companies in Egypt, doing worse. So yes, it may be just because it's in the Dutch, because that's a good place to launch your European company, but we'll look at the details behind that later. But yeah, again, these are examples. But Francis, we've had the response from the poll, so I can take an opportunity whilst I'm here to also take a water. So any questions we've got so far?
Yes, Rob, I can see a question there from Betty Wilkinson. I'm not sure whether that's for you to best address or it's for Leslie. I think Betty is asking on the impact on formal or informal industry credit ratings and interbank data sharing.
Yeah, this is. I will cover this one because it is into the processing. So before you share that data, and again, we have a similar problem when it comes to fraud and anti-money laundering. So Betty, you would need specific advice, but the expectation is that all the companies you're sharing with, and I'm just going to quickly go back into the very bad cookie site that is this one here, and go to the Guardian again. You'll see that the way they manage their process is they make it very clear who they're sharing all your data with. And that is the requirement of, now I need to clear the cookies. No, let me just clear my cookies. So that requirement to share who it is a requirement within legislation. So if you know you're going to provide data to company X, Y, or Z, you've got to declare company X, Y, and Z as part of your consent. That's very clear in the latest consent. So this is where the flow of information becomes very important. I'm going to come through that a little bit later when we start establishing the team, because there are lots and lots of implications as you go through this. Let's go to my search and services, clear browsing data. Where am I? So I'm just going to clear those and come back, but I'll do that later on. I'll try and grab some time later on rather than taking too long just to clear my cookies. But that sharing of who's doing what, yes, you've got to make that very, very clear to all organizations. You know, what is the data that you're looking at? How are you managing these things? So unfortunately, yes, it will affect things. When it comes to fraud and compliance, we'll look at those later on. When we come to later on in the tools and resources, we'll go through and we'll look at what we're calling privacy enhancing technologies. The IT industry is stepping up. We're in the early stages, but there are some things happening there, but we'll come to that. Hopefully that answers your question. Francis, any more questions?
No, Rob, I think we can continue also in the interest of time.
Okay, great. Thank you. I'm just noticing we're quite heavily, but we're about 15 minutes behind where I wanted to be. So I will try to be quick. Okay. So as we said, within the documents in the guidance, we do help you a little bit more and go into a lot more detail. So please do, if you get a chance, go look at the documentation. I'm going to look at it at the end because I'm not going to create a pile of links. But the implementation guidance, we go through in a lot more detail, establishing the team, how to set those up. But these are the areas we're going to go through now. As I said early on, the fines do not really encourage strong company investment, but do that strong investment and actually you see advantages in the data. So I'm building my open source for the Gates Foundation using data protection by design, because then it can be applied anywhere. So my product can be passported into the European market. It can be passported into California, knowing we built it from day one to actually work in those environments. So there are advantages if you have ambitions beyond Africa as each regulation changes. Focus on building that by design and understanding your data. One of the key things about most product people is they should be data driven. That means, have you got consent to be data driven? That's the first thing you need to think through, because you're building your product based on customer feedback. Have you got that purpose clearly articulated? But reputational impact, it was great to see in the survey many organizations saying that's going to be a driver. But that will only be relevant if the OPDC actually starts highlighting failures, so your competitors are called out for being bad actors. How that plays in the press is also open. You know, WhatsApp and Amazon being fined, that makes headline news. It's big news. But the thing is that fine is going to be held up in litigation for many years to come. So, you know, the reality of that we'll see in a few years' time. But that legislation does have impact. This is the other side, providing a great user experience and protection of customers. And Leslie Ann's, findings with CGAP that people are willing to pay twice the interest rate, because their data is protected. They will give data, people will give data, but you've got to protect it. Remember, the relationship is not about what can I get out of the customer, but how can I serve the customer? Then you get to the right place. And that's all the law is trying to enforce. The next portion is, do I need it? So where do I start? Do I need a data protection officer? Unfortunately, in a word, no. You don't need a dedicated data protection officer. You need somebody who's going to act and help and coordinate that. If you do appoint them, then there are some implications. You've got to make sure they don't have a conflict of interest. So if they're in the marketing department and the data protection officer, there's going to be a conflict of interest. Plan for those. And the data commission does raise those things. It's also important, if you do have one, they have the necessary skills, legal or technical. I'm sitting in an operational world, which is part of the reason why I have all of these, the required business requisites, because I need to understand the law. I need to understand the data I really need, and my background was technical. So I came from more of a product and a program perspective, and therefore I sit across these worlds, and that's the things you should be looking for. From a role perspective, if you do appoint them, you need to also provide their contact details. So the data controller, if they are managing these tasks, also need to look at the data controller or processor shall publish the contact details, apologies, and use of water, and communicate that data to the data commissioner. So your information should be on your website, but the data commissioner will also make sure that contact point is on their website. What we're seeing is failures to update the commissioner also could lead to some fines coming through. The data protection officer also has a duty within the organization, not just to the controller and the processor, but also ensuring the employees are doing things as per the Act. So that person becomes the key impact and key input and key disseminator of, are we doing the right thing with our data? Again, part of the reason why it's good for a product person to own this, because they have to do that as well as saying, okay, how does my product work? The challenge is when it moves to things like employee data, because employee data can also be deemed personal data. So you're managing the data of your employees. But then you come to, I have a data protection officer. Is that it? Good. I've got my DPO assigned. Well, it depends if you're a small company. If you're a small company, it might be it. If you're a larger organization, yeah, you've got to make sure all the staff are aware of the Act, what they need to do differently. What are the changes I need to have? I print things out. Have you now got a problem you just created? Well, again, we'll go through how you spot these things. The larger your organization, the more people who need to the input to the DPO, because they'll all have different pieces of data all over the place. So you actually can understand all the data you're processing. It's terrifying how much data we process and we don't realize. So you'll need input from all areas of the business where the customer or employee data is captured or processed. Also, by process, we mean output. So where do you save this stuff? Because suddenly you've created data about a customer that you've saved in a file. Does anybody know that that customer data is now in a file? Is that file protected? All these implications you need to work through. And again, we'll go through in a moment how you do that. So every single department of an organization will be affected in some point, some to a smaller or a larger degree. Let's take a shipping note, for example. It has a person's name and address. If you print one out and just throw it away, you've now got personal data that's been printed out and left on the floor. Welcome to a data protection breach waiting to happen. Will it be a serious impact and a serious fine? Possibly not, but you need to be aware of those. If you leave a big list of documentation and leave it on a bus stop, for example, nobody in the UK ever does that. Oh, hang on a second, no, they do. So be careful with your data, but the use of area champions will help you with this. So again, you need more than a DPO, you need people to understand your business. Then, this is just the start of the journey. You'll need to have clarity on the purposes you have that data. You may need new terms and conditions. That's just to get you started. You may then need to make changes to the controls or processes we have in the organization. You need to change your flows. This is where product come back in again, to consent and store this for as long as needed. You then need to consider what that means to if you have agent-based employees. They're capturing this. How is that being captured and recorded and kept? You will need to remove any data where consent is not clear. You need to manage changes in consent. You need to restrict processes when consent is changed. If I remove consent, that data is available. There aren't many tools, to be blunt, that really work on this restricting processes when consent is changed. We've been looking into this as part of our How Do We Build This open source fraud management platform. And this area is actually a lot more complicated than you realize. We've started some conversations with the people in Kenya. The problem is there are a few tools out there, but they're designed for large American corporates. That's not going to make them available. So we've been in chats with organizations in Kenya because there are tools that are needed for the African market to actually drive this, because Kenya's one of the first in Africa, but it won't be the last. So there'll be products that will be built in one country that can be passported to other markets. What happens when you have data change requests? One of the rights of a consumer is, hang on, you've got my name as this. That's wrong. My full name is this. I would like you to change that. And you have to change it. How and what, there are ramifications to that. But again, you need to think these through. The customer has the right to port their data. I would like my data in a digital form, please. They have that right. You can charge them for a memory stick. You can give them free access. Within the examples, we show SD as one of the sales channels that actually provides a really simple process for giving customers their data as part of that data request. But then also the data breaches, what happens when things go wrong? Again, all these things need to be worked through. We go through a lot more detail in the documentation. So now we come to what is a data process impact assessment. The regulator has provided some clearer overviews in this, and we'll come to that towards the end when we complete this. You have to submit a DPIA to the Office of the Data Commissioner. So there's some things we're going to go through very quickly to help you with those. It basically is a process designed, and this is the terminology used by the ODPC, to identify risks arising out of the processing of personal data and to minimize these risks as far and as early as possible. So we'll go through what that means in a second. The controls can be technical or organizational. As we said, if people are printing things out and just leaving them in a bin, you have a data breach. If that data is found, you now have a problem. We'll go through looking at those things as the output. Data protection should be by design and or default. Well, my preference is by design and default, both. You always have it and you always check for it, and things are turned off and access is restricted by default. Start restricting data. I've got used to sharing too much. Restrict it and then work out how you carefully share is more important. So there's going to be a change in how data management tools are being built because of this implication. Once you've done your DPIA, it then needs to be submitted to the ODPC. Again, we'll come through that later. The things it needs to include, what are your processes? the necessity and proportionality. So that's going back to the legislation. Why are you hosting this? Why are you holding this data? Do you really need it? And you need to be able to explain that. The printing it out, putting it on a hosted server, what does that mean? You know, those things need to be looked at. It's not necessary to do a DPIA, but when you do your assessment, so doing the assessment, you might find it's likely to result in a high risk to the rights and freedom of data subjects. This actually is a bit of a gotcha. It looks like, yeah, it's not necessary. Yeah, but it's not necessary. So that means look at it very carefully. Take the example of personal data stuck on a machine that has internet connection. That personal data may seem innocuous as a person's name and address. It's stored on a PC. That PC is in my network. That PC could be hacked. That hacking is a breach. The freedom and the rights of a data subject, their name and address, and if you have more sensitive information or biometric data, if that's released, you've now exposed a high risk. So this likely to result in a high risk to the rights and freedoms of a data subject. You really need to look at this very carefully, because it's failings in this that will find you at the wrong end of the fine. So the areas that need to cover: automated decision making. So this is one of the changes. So coming back to the question earlier, from a process perspective, the fundamental capturing of that data and that decision, that legal decision that you are not getting a contract, if that's done by an automated decision, any artificial intelligence or logic applied to your onboarding, approval, credit scores, etc., that is automatically under the subjects of a DPIA. It's actually worse that you've got to actually have a human in the GDPR say, I've approved and agree with the machine's decision. So again, these are things to be careful. So this is the section that I'm building an automated open source fraud management. I'm putting rules in place. They will make an automated decision against a customer. So Gates Foundation's platform makes an automatic decision. So I'm in bullet point 1. I'm saying I have to be under a DPIA. Next, systematic monitoring. This is data collected through networks or public surveillance equipment in detail. Most CDD, the continuous due diligence platforms, will pull data from external sources, LexisNexis, Reuters, whoever. But this also takes information from social media sites. So if you're using that, you're now under bullet 2. So then we get into the next bullet point: sensitive personal data, biometric data, property details, marital status, and using any of those for your services, capturing the gender of an individual. That's covered. There's a whole bunch of things that are covered under sensitive personal data. So natural person's race, health status, ethnic social origin, their conscious belief, their genetic data, their biometric data, their property details, their marital status, family details, including names of their children, parents, spouses, sorry, sex, or the sexual orientation of the data subject. All of those are sensitive personal data. You must do a DPIA and look for these things. So as I say, at least 2 of these are likely to be in sensitive personal data. So far, for a fraud management platform, I'm at 3 for 3. Large scale. Unfortunately, I'm being asked to build a platform for a country. Yeah, I'm in the large scale. So that's the definition of large scale, though. This comes from a balance of things. The number of data subjects concerned, the volume and or range of the data items. If you're capturing a lot of data, which you do in a fraud management platform, your range is wide. Your volume may also be high, but the 2 together are very large. The duration or permanence of this activity, how long do you have this data? In fraud management, we store for 13 months. Yeah, we're into that as well. The geographical context, yes, I know where you spent your money, therefore, so again, your platforms are likely to be looking at this from a financial services because you store it by legislation for at least 6 years. So the combination then also might cause a breach. So the matching or combining of data sets. So when you have lots of data sets and go, okay, this information here and this information here, I'm joining it together, you need to make sure that your purposes cover that joining together as well. Any information covering vulnerable data subjects, this is children, people with incapacities, there are definitions within the Act. Innovative user or applying new technological or organizational solutions. We're fintech. We claim to be doing innovative use by default. So again, we're now in the same space. Or the processing itself prevents a data subject from exercising a right. A rejection or a blocking of a payment is in that list. So unfortunately, other than I'm not too sure about data concerning vulnerable data subjects, building a fraud management platform, I am by default under every single one of these and must perform a data protection impact assessment, which is why this is really important for anybody working within the financial services world, because if you've got a fraud management platform, you're doing majority of these and therefore must do the assessment. So on pages 12 to 17, I'm just going to quickly jump into the government's guidance. So give me a second whilst I do this. On pages 12 to 17, they provide the actual impact assessment they're going to follow. Sorry, opening the wrong page. Let's move this over here. So this is the guidance here. So I'm just going to zoom in a moment. I'm just quickly using this to jump through. So this is pages 12 to 17. This is what you must fill in for your data protection impact assessment. And that's per purpose. So suddenly you're filling in a lot of information. So be aware there's a lot to do. So page 16, they provide a risk register. For people who've never done a risk register, in a moment, we're just going to help you with that. They're asking for, let me just show you the specific text. Unfortunately, it's sideways. So let's see if we can rotate a moment. So they're asking here for the assessment of risk, the impact and likelihood. For those of you working in risk management, this is what they're asking here for, what is called the residual risk. A risk manager is interested in first the inherent risk. I have, going back to my example I used earlier, data sitting on a PC. There is sensitive data. There is a risk associated with that. What's the likelihood that that PC is going to be hacked? Well, actually, more simply, what's the likelihood someone could save that file offline? High. What is the risk of that? Well, if it's the full data set of every single customer, the impact is high. So we need to make sure we identify those. We then apply controls. Okay, you can't save files or download information because I can no longer control it. And then once you've applied your controls, you review residual risks. So let's just go into a little bit more detail because likelihood high isn't very helpful. So two variables, as we said, likelihood and the impact. How likely is it something will go wrong? And if it does go wrong, how damaging is that? Both using a scale of 1 to 5. Mentally, we're comfortable with the terms very low, low, medium, high, and very high. A number of those, then we can say, well, actually, the likelihood's very low. The impact is very low. And then we can apply those things by multiplying them together to get what we call a risk score. So if we then, so let's take it as our example. We have data on a server. There's no firewall, there's no nothing. It's just a web server and it's got all of our data. We start with that, we have that data. It's a database of every single one of our customers and all their sensitive data. So we know the likelihood of it being hacked is very high. We're a financial services business, we're very high target. And all of our data is going to be released. So again, very high. So we're going to say 5 by 5. So the score here is 25. Eventually, we're going to put this through a score matrix, and that puts it at the highest risk. So we're going to say that this item is probably the most important thing we need to do is put some security around that server. So let's look at the types of security we can implement. Put in place a firewall. That reduces the likelihood of a breach. So we'd say our breach would drop to 3. I've not dropped it to 1 because it stops an external hacker. It doesn't stop an internal employee stealing this data and abusing it, taking it home, and suddenly it's on someone's home computer. Again, so you haven't eliminated the risk completely. You then go to the next step, which is, okay, now I have got that problem of an employee. Can I do anything with that? Well, I'm now going to encrypt it at rest and in transit. So this is the process. I'm just saw a comment coming up on the health data. Yes, that watch is covered. The likelihood and impact of this of the 5 by 5, starting with a very high impact, very high likelihood. We've got the likelihood down to 3, and the impact, if we encrypt, is also down to 3. Again, We've not stopped internal actors who could basically take this data and extract it. So we haven't got rid of it completely. So we now reduce this score to 9. So this residual score, 9, is what we would share with the data commission. So these are real examples of challenges. So I'll come back to the questions later, but those we're going to go into a bit more detail in a moment of, okay, now I know what I've got to start doing. Where do I start with my data? So Francis, I'm just conscious again of time. It's 10:30. We are about 5 minutes behind schedule, so we're doing okay. But do we have a moment just to stop for questions? I can.
Yes, yes, Rob. And if you go to the question and A, panel, you'll see a question there from Abel.
Is there a use case and real example where clients were able to collect their data from providers? Yes. So in the document, we use a company, as I say, called a sales company called SD, who's based here in the United Kingdom. And I did a data subject access request. I've done a few of these just for fun. One, I had a rental contract and I asked for a data subject access request, and I got back basically a very large black book. They basically redacted absolutely everything, and every so often I could see my name. As a data response, it was useless. But SD, actually, they collate, and they have an automated system, and we use it as an example of very good user experience in the document of an organization that shows you, I make a request, I go into the website and say, I have a data subject access request. And within 48, well, they give themselves, they've technically got 28 days, but within 48 hours, they sent me all the data I had in their environment. They sent me absolutely everything they had collected on me within 48 hours. So that's where you can, and you have the right. It's not the case if they can say, oh, I don't. Where they obfuscate is they say, oh, we've anonymized it, and I can get to this, and I can do X, Y, and Z. We go into anonymization and pseudonymization because everyone thinks that anonymizing things makes it anonymous. No, it makes it a little bit anonymous, but actually the Turing Institute are adopting principles and processes to identify. And there is some research that we highlight in the document that actually you can go and identify a human being based on adding just a few more data points. So when we think it's anonymous, it's not as anonymous as we'd like. So this is also important when we're looking at how we hide data. So we're using pseudonymization. So we take, within the open source platform, we take the user's name and their date of birth, the only two things we really need, we can lock around, and we create a unique identifier. Technically, I've got another identifier for the same individual, so all I've got to do is I now know this information. It doesn't give me anything that I can work with when I look at it, and I separate, so separation of data. I separate all the address data from this user, so the two sources aren't easily linked. The point of reference is different for both. But if I knew the name and address and the hashing algorithm, I could create that and get the data anyway. So, computing power can quickly bypass most controls you put in place, but it's making at least a starting effort to reduce the types of data that's being exposed. So looking at your table structures and how your data is hanging together and how you break it apart and make it anonymous is the excuse that's used when people say, oh, I've not got your data, it's not readily available. Okay, well, how come this advert's following me then? How come why you're using that data and you're creating an aggregate? Okay, but you're clumping me into that aggregate because something you have has put me into there. So they do have that data. The challenge you've got when you're asking is, what was your IP address at a given time? It might have changed. Etc. Those are the sorts of things that, there are techniques, but again, we go into more detail in the documents. I'll leave the second question to the anonymous attendee. It is to an offline if we can. Those are the questions there. I see some tools coming in. Is there any questions in the chat? Because we're not being put into the Q&A, so I'm hoping the Q&A questions, I'm not going to be going through the chat, unfortunately, with the timeout. But if any of those questions need to come through, if you can move them into the Q&A, that'd be much easier.
Yes, we can move those to the Q&A, and again at that point we'll call back Leslie, and because there's a very positive discussion going on there.
Cool. Great. Okay, so now just into the process of, okay, where is my data? And again, we've provided some of these tools and access to those within the system. The point here is you've got to go to where do I create or collect data? You also need to look at where you output, but those should be being flushed out as you start at the beginning of the process and go through to the very end. And we walk through in the document an approach to how to develop a simple process map, showing sources of data, where to store it, and how to protect it. So I'm just now going to move quickly into Miro. So we use Miro very regularly in the Emoji Loop and the Axio world. And this is a Miro that we've pulled together just to create a simple process flow, saying, okay, I've got a customer who raises an order, the customer data. So we've just created a simple process flow. I'll show you another example in a moment from Visio. But the reason we're using Miro is that if you've got a large number of interactive users, and post-COVID, there's a lot more people working remotely than used to, but that remote working and getting this information might require you getting everybody around to comment on one specific process flow. The only way you can do that is through a shared tool, because whiteboards have literally at some point become too large. All we've done is we've gone through and said, okay, I've got an order. Where's that being done? Well, it's being done on a computer. So I'm going to take this computer, if it's going to let me. No, it's not allowing me because I'm not signed in. Okay, this is an actor, so I'm just a viewer on this, but I would copy that and paste it next to here. I would then go through, well, okay, I'm also doing it on a mobile. So suddenly I'm identifying my sources and I'm copying and pasting next to the order. I get all of these on a document database. And then the IT person chirps up, yeah, now you've done that, we put it into it goes into a memory store, it goes into a database service. We're starting to capture where is the data, and we can quickly and easily get the view from all the participants. Unfortunately, this is the domain of enterprise system architects, where a lot of information is becoming available. And a lot of processes require a high level. This is where we're at here, and the drill down is where you flush the details out. I'll go in the next slide and show you where we've got into using a Visio process flow. But again, the same thing could be done in Miro. We just use Visio because it was predefined for that. The problem is the cost of Visio is a lot higher, whereas this is on a free board. You can do this for zero cost and have as many actors getting involved as you need. And then once you've done it, you can export this data by highlighting it and export it to a Word document, so you can quickly get your information back out. But then you can quickly apply any identity and access management that's being applied for this order process, the resources that are being used, multi-factor authentication, whether it's being encrypted. You can quickly and easily visualize where you are and start building up your register of things. And we can then also categorize the types of data. So just by dragging and dropping these fields onto a given place, you can quickly build that process flow. I'm just going to jump now to a Visio version of this. So this was done in Visio, where the process flow was drawn out a little bit more, and we put in that the capture process was going to a database. We could have done all of this in Miro. I just wanted to test the two tools as a comparator. And we can see here that as we're going through, I started creating data sets of what is it, and categorize those data sets. This is personal identifiable information. It's a customer's ID. Why is that PII? Because if you get this, you can identify that's a given person, and this person is now across all the platforms visible. From a fraud management perspective, as I said, we capture absolutely every single piece of data and do so much with it if we're doing our jobs properly, that that central platform will be, unfortunately, so data rich, it's part of your data warehouse. But again, that's the challenges that you face, is that you need this data to do your job and to protect your customers. So this is where fraud is part of one of those for financial services, one of the areas there's a legitimate and lawful use for it. But again, you've got to make sure that capture of that data is very clear. But this is making you capture and tell your customer what data you're capturing and why. You're making those things very simple. I'm seeing there's lots of requests. Yes, the presentation will be shared, as will the recording. Okay, this is the other big question. So I'm just conscious we're running out of time, and I want to get to some more of the tools. So this guidance, when it came out, said that you're likely to have to host your data in Kenya. And there was uncertainty what that meant. Unfortunately for all financial services institutions, you've got to host your data. There's still a grey area within this, is that it's for the processing of that data. So when we look at the processing, the term processing, what does that really mean? Well, actually something comes in, gets changed and comes out again, or something comes in, gets reviewed and comes out again. That's the very definition of a computer processor. So does saving it classify it as processing? I don't think so. But if you are a regulated financial services entity, you are not allowed to host outside of Kenya. Full stop. You must have at least one serving copy stored in a data center located in Kenya. This clause B here. At least one serving copy of a concerned person's detailed data is stored in a data center located in Kenya. But the processing is effected through a server and data center located in Kenya. So A is the, I'm going to do some smart stuff with it. You're definitely covered. It has to be in Kenya. B, the serving copy means that can you save this into a cloud that's in Europe? No, there's no equivalency of that. And this legislation is worth looking at what happened in the Schrems 2, as it's called. So Schrem is a person who's not happy with he's a European citizen, he's not happy with the acts, the Patriot Act in the United States, and therefore hosting in the United States is a point of contention for him. And he's making it very clear, and has rightly challenged the hosting and the equivalency. The US Patriot Act, if you're not aware of it, gives the US government the absolute right, without telling anybody, the ability to go and look at all data because it's hosted in the United States. That means if your email goes through a US data server, the US services can go and read it whenever they wish. That is the law within the United States. That is the challenge of hosting. This is why the Kenyan government is rightly protecting their citizens from a lot of these activities. So from that perspective, there's a whole bunch of things that you need to look at, but the hosting for financial services, if you're in that regulated category, you're definitely there. There's also a clause that because the country wants to grow and develop its data centers, to force people. That might be applied to other organizations, but again, look into the details of the act a little bit more. You've also got to consider, I'm just going to do a quick video at this point, on how you share data. As I say, one of the challenges with financial services, I send money from my financial entity to another financial entity. Hang on, I'm a bit suspicious about these two people. I know my customer, but I don't know the other customer. I trust the other person knows their customer, but I'm worried about this transaction, and I should possibly be suspicious about my customer. I'm just going to ring up my friend at the bank and just say, I've just had a transaction go through. Could you tell me if you're happy with the person who's receiving it, if they're actually who they claim to be? Because I think it's a fraud. Under data protection, no response. You can say nothing. So this challenge of how and what you do, I'm not going to show the video, unfortunately I'm going to time out. But I was fortunate to be part of a digital sandbox pilot with our fraud management platform. As part of that sandbox pilot, under the UK's Financial Conduct Authority, there were other organisations, a company called Sedici we work very closely with. So closely I've offered the guy that you'll see on the video a job. He's now working for us. But for the digital sandbox, they basically presented how the sharing of information between one company and another could be done. There was another company that was doing the same thing as under the project MPC 4AML. I'm just going to quickly click on it. You have to register, but the videos are still available. If you go into the financial conduct, the digital sandbox pilot, you go into here and you should be able to get in. I'm just going to click on that link again, because it should take me straight in this time because I'm logged in. So this video here goes into a little bit more detail, but it's 10 minutes long and it covers privacy enhancing technology. The technique here is our platform. So we work with Sedici. We found a problem in the platform. We found a problem with a customer. And that customer belongs to us as a financial entity. We wanted to talk to the other financial entity and get this information sharing, but data protection prevents us from doing that. So the digital sandbox pilot was, how do we encourage both detection of fraud but privacy enhancing technologies? And these areas we explore in a lot more detail in the book, because those explorations and those investigations, who's looking at what and why, is part of your GDPR. When we first implemented a fraud management platform in the Challenger bank I was working at, we had to go back in and turn off our download data options because that was in breach with data protection. So again, all these things of your working processes, you've got to consider both how you share internally and externally. I'm not going to spend more time than that on this, but I will point people. There will be a link in here to the Digital Sandbox pilot. Please do go have a look. There's some good guidance on that. And going back to one of the questions we asked very early on for what are the opportunities and challenges? No one identified these. This is a growing area. It will grow dramatically. So please do look. Again, there's some more resources here that we've shared. We've got into cybersecurity. There's lots of things where we've got lots of data and not a lot of awareness on cybersecurity. Well, actually, there's some freely available. The Carnegie Institute, the guys from Strathmore, I'm not sure if Richard's on the call. I met Richard from Strathmore University. They're involved in this cybersecurity in the financial system. It's freely available resources to help you get started. In the open source world, but again, just because it's open source doesn't mean it's not good educational training. There's some really good training courses freely available on how to improve your process and controls on developing software. So how to get some training. There's free courses. Take advantage of these. That is almost me. I've got the finding the hidden data, and I'm literally going to spend 2 minutes on this. There's an area that we always forget, unstructured data. Going back to my email server, I've taken a screenshot, stuck that into a web page, and it's gone in there. I've got unstructured data. That data, unfortunately, because it's not structured, is the most complex to manage. So that unstructured data, you've got to look at as well. I don't think the Data Commission, but again, it's thought, not legal counsel. I don't think the Data Commission is going to focus here. They've got enough stuff to do, but building processes to look at your unstructured data, the PDFs you have, the screenshots you have, all of those have sensitive data. If they've got data on those and they get breached, you've had a data breach. You need to look at those. There are tools coming and they're based on artificial intelligence, but the bad news, a lot of them are hosted in the cloud and not Kenyan cloud. So if you're in a financial services domain, you can't use these services. So we provide a link to, and we go into a bit more detail of the process for artificial intelligence. For those who want to get an idea of, okay, I want to build my own AI to do this, this is a process of what you should be doing and what you should be looking at. So a lot of things in here of how you manage your unstructured data and how you build the AI. The tools that they're talking to, majority are using their monkey learn tools, but there are open source alternatives. Again, I just want to spend the last few minutes of the call going through those other tools. But again, we provide those to people and they're in detail in the document. So quickly implementing the DPIA. Again, the guidance that's come from the regulator is more than adequate. So this is the same guidance we did earlier. And I point people back at the document. I'm just going to quickly find this a second. Back at the guidance from the ODPC themselves. Sorry, 1 second. On implementing a DPIA. Go through this. So some of the things we've gone through, that building your process, understanding your risks, all of those get you the information, knowing where your data is. All of those get you the information you need to fill in pages 12 to 17 of this document. So, hopefully you don't need to go into detail, but your goal is to fill in this document in detail for your organization and send that in for assessment by the ODPC. All of that is well covered by this document, so I don't need to go into detail. There are also, prior to this guidance, there are websites for this and tools available that I'll go into that are probably more beneficial. I'm just going to jump into my presentations, just stop sharing, finishing. So from we'll just go to the very end. Apologies for those who are going to have a sudden flash of lots of lights. That should keep stopping. Okay, I'm going too quick for my own good. I'm trying to rush. Let me come back to that in a second. I'm just going to jump straight into, rather than going to the slide that tells me to go to the document, I'm just going to go to the document. So this is the document that we've shared today. I'm just going to jump down to pages 20 onwards. So as I say, all of this is covered within the document, and we've gone through these So the self-guidance for AI we've just gone through is here. But the last implementation examples, okay, so here's some examples we've gone through, we mentioned earlier, but just going back a second to the tools, we create, and we've collated a list within the page, and I'm just going to zoom in a bit so you can see this clearly. So what we've done is identified and captured all the tools, and again, these are in the document, so I'm not going to labour this point too long. But we've provided tools for data protection impact assessment. There are hyperlinks available for each of these that you can go to. There's a breach incident record log, a personal that there's some sample templates, data flow illustrations, consent registries, a process for dispute resolution. All these things have been covered. I saw briefly pop up the French Commission Nationale d'Informatique, the CNIL stuff. That's also covered in there, as well as there are tools for completing a data protection impact assessment. All these tools are available. I provided links to just doing a Google search, unveiled them, but I've curated that list a little bit and provided some examples and said, okay, great, there's a list, that might be too discrete. Look at these ones in detail. So again, we've provided these within here. So hopefully, time is against us. We've also provided the AWS, Azure, and Google Cloud. We provided that before we knew that you couldn't host. So Azure are probably being actively encouraged to host within Kenya. But I'm going to whistle stop there and say, please do take some time to go through this document. I'm hoping it's going to be of great value to you. And Francis, back to you.
Rob, thanks. That's a nice segue to actually a conversation that I'm seeing on the chat, I think from Mercy, with regards to the issue of hosting. It's a long text there. I don't want to read all of it.
So let's not read the text and let's just look to what the law states. So hosting, I think we've covered it just briefly. And I apologize, I was going to pour a drink, but I'll wait, hold fire that and we'll focus on. So if I dry up, I may have to stop. But the hosting within Kenya is a mandatory requirement for all regulated entities, and there is detail within the document on that and within the document we're going to share. From that perspective, you have to host it within Kenya for the Processing Act. The grey area is, what does processing mean? Storing files, i.e. your backups and your repositories, though that can happen in that space, but if your email system is in Azure and that's hosted in a non-Kenyan data center and you have an automated process that does something with that, technically you could be deemed as processing. And if all your customer data goes through that, you're processing. And this is the challenge, unfortunately, that regulation and that demand from the regulator that says you must process in Kenya means that you've got to look very carefully at what does your processing do. But you're doing that anyway because you're identifying what does processing mean for me as an organization? What is my purpose? If your purpose is clear and that's part of your email flow, you're processing. That has to happen in Kenya. And unfortunately, the tools that Microsoft, Google, and Amazon make available to actually manage that data, you've got to process it. They're not available to you. You're in a catch-22. So this is an area that really needs to be explored with the commissioner. Great, but I can protect my customers better with the cloud services that exist, but I'm restricted because you've got this processing. Can we have this let? There is an option that for that processing, if there's specific consent from the consumer, then you might be allowed. But again, this is a conversation each company will have to take with the commissioner until they give specific guidance. Simple rule, if lots of people ask the same question, at some point they're going to give guidance and say, look, stop asking me, here's the general guidance. So sorry to say this, if there's a regulator here, my apologies, get some guidance on this fairly quickly, please. If not, everybody else just write to the regulator. And one way or another, you'll get guidance.
Rob, maybe as you cut a glass of water, I saw that Leslie Ann was in an exchange with Mercy on that. I think drawing from an example of part of our earlier work.
Yeah.
Leslie Ann, do you just want to come in for a minute on that? You're on mute.
Nothing major to add on this, but even before there was cloud, we were having these conversations in Kenya with regulatory mindset in play, with financial services in play. And so very much over the years, as I've been working in this space, the concept of the local copy has been central, because you can get far more efficient services when you are able to use economies of scale of things like the cloud. So it was quite important to us to kind of try to push for centralized services. So when I was in my fintech for 3 years, again before cloud, again we had this competition globally. It is a conversation globally, and it's one that the AWS and Azure are having with regulators as well, to figure out how can we get the economies of scale, because ultimately, if you're trying to create a product for financial inclusion customers, the efficiencies are really important. So no major conversation adds, but actually what I can see in the chat is so much knowledge in the Kenyan conversation already. And so I actually said to the team, to the guys who were applying, you should connect with Francis and have this conversation through working papers and bring this conversation to light. It's worth connecting with Francis after this event.
Thanks, and that's really important because we started this work, I think, toward mid last year, and by that time the act was in place. The regulations weren't issued yet; they're in draft now, and we hadn't seen any guidance from the data commissioner. But already there were these conversations that were bubbling there, fintech ecosystem, with people wondering how we're going to start, doing the right thing, even as we wait for proper guidance on the regulator. So I think the point to note that is the framework is still very fluid, and of course some of these things are going to unravel as the data commissioner issues more guidance.
I'm just coming back to a comment, because I've just scrolled back up to see the one from Eric. Yes, processing, but for storing the data. But unfortunately, the legislation says if you process. So even that processing, even if you process that processing of the financial services, and there are a few other organizations that are covered, but that processing is also included. So the hosting is a big debate, and actually a topic I think, as Leslie has pointed out, engage with Francis on this. This is an area where actually driving new thinking on this is an area that does need to be explored, because until such time as there are data centers, I see that there are some data centers in Kenya, which is great, but some of the services they offer may not provide the same flexibility, and for some organizations, no offense, that the reason that the likes of Amazon and Google give you free as a startup is because they want you addicted. Migration is possibly a lot more complicated because your processes become intrinsically entwined with their managed services. You don't have the same functionality when you migrate. That migration is a very, very complicated process, and conversation with the data commissioner on this is going to be a very important thing. So get in early and start those conversations. But Francis, I'm sure you're going to be inundated at the end of this call, I'm afraid.
There's an awesome comment from Mercy on this. She said that actually this question was asked of the task force. There's a roundtable with cloud providers on the same, and her office reiterated serving copy provisions do not preclude the use of cloud services. So there's really good conversation already happening. There's a moment of surfacing it so that I guess the ultimate goal of this conversation is, yes, be compliant, but also think about it during your product design and your process design and your service design. And so there's a need for the conversation to also include, I guess, the product managers, the commercial teams, as well as the legal teams and the IT teams.
Thanks, Leslie. Rob, I guess now is a good time to look at the poll.
Yes. So I can stop. I'm no longer sharing, hopefully. So how do I get the poll back up? I don't know how to.
I can see it on my.
Okay.
1 minute. Maybe as we try and figure that out, is there anything else in the chat that?
I've not asked you. Are you okay if I share that link to that Slack group that I shared with you earlier? I'd rather, that was just for our internal discussions, but it's your call if you want to. We can create another link if you wish for sharing the Slack. So I see people asking, great to connect. There are product calls, there are agile teams, they're all existing, but getting into a community and starting to share challenges and try not to share customer details, that's what you're not meant to be doing, but sharing the challenges is exactly what we should be doing because it will help each other.
share my screen. Thumbs up, Rob, if you can see.
I'm just going to say yes, I can see that. Yes.
So with regards to who is in the room today, we have a couple of guys there, I think, on finance, technical areas, product development, good, policy and regulation, very good, thanks. On the type of company, financial services, the majority, I see a couple of fintechs in the room, institutions, other types of data being.
You're just sharing the Zoom link. You're not sharing the poll results. It could be that Zoom's preventing you from sharing its own data, which is quite a smart. Oh, there we go. The poll results. It's just been popped up now. So is hopefully everyone's seeing that. It's popped up on everyone's screens.
Yep. So yeah, cybersecurity. Let me just scroll back to where I was before.
We have other technical areas and product development. I'm glad to see lots of product development people, because that's the, you know, it will affect you. And the other technical areas, I'm assuming, you know, because it's a broad area, you know, this has a big impact. So those, thank you. Leslie-Anne has to drop away, I'm afraid. So Leslie-Anne, thank you very much for the context and setting and for actually spurring this work on. So greatly appreciated. But the other technical, so it's good to see a lot of people. There's a few people involved in policy and regulation as well, which is great.
Types of data, KYC, background checks, payments. This is interesting. Majority don't share data. And this also speaks to the point that you raised, Rob, that you don't really need a data protection officer, but I guess it's up to the firms.
I will just comment, I think that's sad. I think that's a failing, and it's one of the, you know, back to the legislation. It's the, unfortunately, I think everybody should have a data protection officer. In my case, I'm the CEO, and that's me. My team hate me, but I will at some point have to delegate that responsibility. I'm a team of 15 people, so it's not massive. I can manage that. But the importance of data protection, you know, and starting with that, actually having somebody focused on that, there's a lot to understand. There's continuous changes, you know, the regulation and the guidance is continually updating a lot of processes. So not having a dedicated processing officer, data protection officer is difficult, but getting somebody who can act as that is really, really important, because if you get it right, you know, back to the CGAP findings, that 10% interest rate compared to a 1.5, that's a big delta. The question would be, how far could you go with that? It's a different debate, but for the fact that people were willing to take the higher with protection than the lower without, people do see value in that.
Could you just speak briefly to the last poll result?
Yeah, so we ran out of time to share this properly, but within the guidance, there are some DSAR. There's an open source tool for managing data subject access requests. We also provided guidance on this. This is a bit of a shame. I see there's some more questions coming up. It's a bit of a shame on a number of the elements. The data subject access request is a fundamental right that people can have. I can write in and say, I am Francis, I'd like my information, please. I don't have to provide any evidence. So we've provided that back to the regulator, is that the one part where I can get a data breach and initiate one is on the data subject access request. But you don't have to validate that the person is who they claim to be. If they want to change the data, port the data or anything else, you have to validate. But the data subject access request, you don't. So that's the first step. Make sure you're giving data to the person who they actually are, who they claim to be. That, even though the regulation doesn't require it, just common sense alone says please do. Then the data subject, you have to respond within a certain time frame. There are limitations under GDPR. You cannot go beyond 30 days because you've got to respond. Under GDPR, you can say it's difficult. and I need to get more time. But you've got to say that within 30 days and then respond from request to response in 60 days. So there is a window of response, and we're expecting guidance to come from the Commissioner to refine that data subject access policy. The guidance they issued was a consultation paper. So we're hoping the feedback we gave as part of that consultation will lead to some of those improvements. But those are the sorts of things, the data subject access request and not sharing too much is a challenge.
Rob, I'm just going to allow one person to speak for the sake of time. Emmanuel. Yeah. I've unmuted you. I think you can continue. I'm not sure what's happening. Emmanuel, I think you need to unmute first. Okay, maybe that's a legacy hand. Maybe I can give the chance to someone else before we close. Anything press. Since we're done then.
There are some more questions coming from Eric.
Sure.
Look at Schrems. Go look at what Schrems 2 does, because that adequate data protection laws. Welcome to post-Brexit UK. It is possible the UK may not have adequacy for sharing of data between the countries. So there are some real implications. Again, guidance needed from the regulator on the adequacy data protection laws, because technically the US hosting had adequate, but the Privacy Act pierced that veil. What used to be called that has gone because of the Patriots Act, and Schrems 2 has made that very clear. So subject to what happens in markets, you may find yourself in the same space, but this is going to be a challenge. Any organization that's running and hosting services across multiple countries in Africa will want to optimize, and therefore non-equivalency between the various countries with data protection is going to be an important point. I'm going to put a challenge for Francis and for FSD and say, this is an area I think you can really help the community, and actually as FSD, help everybody on this, because it's where I want to grow my business, but I don't want to have the cost of 5 data centers. That's completely against everything we've been building in the product world for financial services anyway. So again, these are the sorts of things that we do need to lobby effectively on. And that lobbying, again, the Kenyan Lawyers Hub, using those, and we've, again, I see Richard is on the call. We mentioned him earlier, but Strathmore were part of the Carnegie Institute, again, lobbying together and saying, okay, how can we lobby effectively for the financial services industry to find the best things, is something that would really benefit having those activities. I'm afraid I'm going to have to, I see people having to drop off, so I think we'll just finish up in a moment. But yeah,
thanks.
The centre
Thank you.
Would be a very important part. So, sorry, Emmanuel.
Thank you very much, actually, for that. Sorry, I'm in a very noisy place, so I had to move very far from all the construction. Yeah, but thank you very much. I mean, and Leslie, for your presentations. Lots actually to think about, lots to consider when you're talking about data. You guys have really gone deep into this, and I'm actually looking forward with Masiko Agri-Spain to dive deep and more into this data space. We do have a data case on our website, the Masiko Agri-Spain website, and also we have a data readiness tool that we use, or organizations can use to check how ready they are for accepting data or what kind of data they're collecting. And we look forward to working with the organizations that are represented here to use that tool to just look at how ready they are or assess their readiness to use data, and also work with the FSDK to further this conversation on data and all the other organizations that are interested. Thank you very much for this opportunity. Thank you. Over.
Thank you, Emmanuel. And I must say that when we started this work, we had the target audience as actors in the financial sector, but I guess all this can be applied across all the sectors. The data DAPA applies to all sectors in the economy and not just the financial sector. And I think one thing, Rob, that we forgot to mention was on the issue of taking the orientation towards the web-based application rather than the mobile application. Do you want to speak on that as we close?
Yeah, again, this is the challenge with, unfortunately, I'm based in the UK, so getting access to USSD screens to take some screenshots is quite complicated. But we took a web pace because most organizations start their journey into mobile apps with adaptive web pages. So they're quite easy to follow through. But your consent is not just the cookies. We use those as an example to give people, everyone's focused there and done lots of things in that space. But the reality is the work is absolutely everything you do with your customer might require consent for you to process. Consider the process of in your mobile app, if you need data for a new purpose, asking for that, it's back into the gradual incremental pieces of I need it, if I get this data, I need it for this process. When you need them to actively involve in that process, ask them, but don't make your dependence upon data so high, or find ways of making sure that when you do process the data, there's zero consumer data, so it's completely anonymized. That's a harder task than you realize, and expect that to be the challenge that the commissioner will come through. But we focus on web pages because they're easy to get to, rather than some apps are restricted to a country's residents, and we didn't have people in country to actually do that. So my apologies for that. But again, start sharing them, start identifying, call people out who have a bad user experience. Let the newspapers know that this is a really bad user experience. It's rubbish, because they're the worst. Because I showed you the British newspapers. You go to the systems, they choose. That's the experience they give you. So you can choose the experience you give your customers, and that's really important.
Thanks, Rob. That's a nice place to leave it at. We are just 10 minutes beyond time. Thank you, everyone, for making the time. I appreciate it. For those who are joining us from Kenya, you could visit FFT Kenya's pages. The report that we've just shared today will be published there. You could also go check out the work that Rob is doing, LexTego, and MFX partners. And for now, thank you, Rob. That was brilliant. And to everyone else, have a good day. Thank you.
Thank you for the opportunity, and hopefully people won't get bored by the long document, but hopefully it'll be of help. So an absolute pleasure. Thank you.
Okay. Bye-bye, everyone.